Let's talk about topic number two, which is Google's antitrust case, which is getting to the pointy end of the conversation. We have people in the Trump administration saying things like, hey, the remedy for this antitrust monopolistic behavior should be looking forward to the future, not just to the past. And, essentially alluding to the fact that they want to target their AI efforts. They're talking about the fact that Google has been paying Samsung to pre-install their apps, even recently, of their Gemini app and so on. And Perplexity was asked to testify, and they've written a public post, which is really worth reading. We'll put it in the show notes. But the general gist of it is that they're saying, look, the remedy isn't to break Google up or to do some of the other stuff that the government is proposing, but only to force them to let people choose. The quote from the post here is, when these rules for OEMs and carriers first launched in 2009, Google required them to include 12 of their Google apps by default on Android, they're referring here, which has now ballooned to 30 apps in 2024. And today, 6 of those apps must be undeletable. And so their argument is, hey, Android is ostensibly open source, or at least one of the examples of their argument is that Android is open source, but Google's, rules and payments and policies and incentives are basically saying, hey, if you want any of our apps, you've got to install all of our apps, and that's monopolistic behavior. And that's just one example of the things that they're claiming that they've done. And they're, of course, Perplexity is a competitor to Google, and they want equal access on the device and to be able to compete. Amir, what do you make of it? I've got some very interesting opinions about this, like kind of contradictory feelings about this, Amir, but you go first. What do you think about this?
I also have contradictory feelings about this. Like I like to be on the startup side, and I think that like from a user, maybe I'd like choice. Probably not. I'd like good defaults rather than choice. In my experience as a product leader, users don't want choice. They want amazing defaults that actually work. And I think Apple has proven that. And the world is a world of OEM. So basically the world is like, at least the Google world is an OEM. So like as a software vendor, you work with a manufacturer and you decide what is installed and what is not installed. That was true when if you're old enough, when we used Nokia and you had apps on it. It's true when you open up your first iPhone, you get software that is installed by the software vendor. Being uninstallable, I don't know how I feel about that, but I do like the fact that everything connects and everything works together. I don't think there's an evil part here. I think from my experience working at Google, Google just creates more things, and then strong PMs decide to put those things inside the deal with Samsung. And Samsung says, yes, we'll get free software. So we're going to put and you're paying us. So we're going to put all your software there. I don't think this is a valid way. I think it is a valid way to do business. And I don't think I'd like to have the government try to change that. So like if Perplexity is really, really good, their app should be amazing and should be installed on every phone. The fact that Google has distribution should be relevant if they really, really excel.
Yeah. Well, look, Amir, it's funny, like everything old is new again, right? This is very much like the Microsoft antitrust case in the 90s. And it's about flexing your market power to compete, to basically get people to use your apps, not on the basis of the open market, but on the basis of being able to exploit your existing power, right? And in this case, like one of the things that Chris read out from this Perplexity letter is, if you want to pre-install any Google app, you are forced to pre-install all Google apps, right? And so this is one of those examples where they're saying, okay, Google are using their influence over their Android ecosystem, their sort of very broad distribution of applications to say, well, we're going to use our stronger apps to kind of compel use or compel installation of our weaker apps. And so it's no longer a kind of a fair competition. And so that means that these pre-installed apps are not necessarily the best ones. They just happen to be Google's ones because Google is using that power. And so I think, yes, I agree, like choice is clumsy, right? And I remember the remedy in the EU for the Microsoft case was having this kind of modal pop-up when you installed Windows and said, which browser would you like to install? And no one wants that, right? But I think what you can do potentially is compel some of these, monopolistic practices like that. If you want one app, you have to install all the apps. You can compel Google to stop doing that. And that seems pretty reasonable to me.
Yeah, as I alluded to, I'm in two minds about this, and I frame it a little bit similar to Amir, which is this: on one hand, you want startups to have space, to be able to have a chance to succeed, to innovate, to win, and on the other hand, you don't want the government getting in the way of private deals and private decision making, private product management, and so on. The argument for startups is obvious, right? Which is, if Perplexity is coming up and trying to innovate, and Google is by default installed everywhere, they're using their marketing muscle and their dollars to win. Bad for Perplexity, and I feel for Perplexity. If I was Perplexity, I'd feel really upset about that. But the argument for Google, I think, is a little bit more subtle and nuanced. They built Android. That's the house they built. They innovated, they deployed capital, they built Rails, they built partnerships, they built an app store, they built incredible integration, they had the foresight. That is their home. They built it. And they're allowed to bundle their apps with the bloody thing. And they're not even bundling it with the open source Android. They're bundling it as a separate deal, if I'm reading this correctly, which is, you get Android for free with no strings. But if you want our apps on Android, which, by the way, we bloody built, you have to take all our apps. It's you have to enter in our ecosystem. That's how our ecosystem works. And as far as I'm concerned, that's just standard product and business and deal making. And it's like, who the hell are the government to tell people like that you're not allowed to do that? They built the Rails, they built the platform, they built the deal.
Well, I think that the point of antitrust, Chris, is that things that are okay when you don't have a monopoly stop being okay when you do have one, right? And I think that's kind of the point here, which is like, okay, if Google's some little upstart and they want to have these bundling deals in the house that they built, then of course that's 100% legitimate. But once you have monopoly or monopoly-like market power, then it stops being like that sort of innovative capitalist kind of red and tooth and nail competition, and it becomes rent-seeking behavior where you're like, we don't have to innovate. We can crush our competition simply by our incumbency. And whether or not it's a house that you built, you're not allowed to do that. And I think that's really, the question is, to what extent are they a genuine monopoly? Because I completely agree that, that the government, when you have a real monopoly, the government absolutely has not just the right, but the obligation to get involved.
Yeah, but I just think that this is a difference in scale, not a difference in substance, and I feel like that means it's a double standard. But here's the clincher: you said it's like Microsoft all over again. It is like Microsoft all over again. And here's what happened to Microsoft: the government stepped in at the exact wrong time for Microsoft. They dismantled their ability to compete in the internet business and in the mobile business. They screwed Microsoft. They screwed a serious competitor now that they would have been 3 players instead of 2. So they undermined the chance for innovation and choice by distracting and dismantling Microsoft. For what? And this is the same critical time, which is Google is now under existential threat from AI, and they're trying desperately to catch up and keep up. And and as far as kind of Western power goes, we need a Google to be at full strength to compete with a China and the rest of the world. And they're being distracted and disentangled at an absolutely critical time that I don't think is necessarily appropriate. I think it's overreach.
I want to add one thing. I don't think Perplexity is that naive. I think what they want is distribution. When they say choice, they say, "Hey, put us on the drop down. We want Samsung. We want to be distributed with every Samsung." So basically, they're looking for distribution. And if you look on the other side, again, my point is that if the Perplexity is that good, it will be installed on every phone. Well, I just installed my new Mac Studio. It's a beast. The first thing I did was open up my hated Safari and installed Chrome. And that is it. And I never saw Safari again. I make it a default, and that's it. If Perplexity wants to win, they can win. Chrome win. Many other, like Spotify won. You can win the distribution without trying to get yourself monopolized, like to start using monopoly law against your competition.
Yeah, look, I guess I'm just going to dissent on this. I think even what you said, Chris, that, if Microsoft hadn't had antitrust used against them, we'd have 3 strong competitors instead of 2. I think it's just as plausible to say we would have had one instead of two, and that one would have been Microsoft, because they had effectively deployed their power for a long time to stifle innovation. And yeah, maybe Microsoft got screwed because they flew too close to the sun. And we've had an incredible era of innovation in mobile and in internet since that period ended. So look, none of us can predict alternative histories, right? But the point is, when you have incredible market power, you are supposed to deploy it carefully. And if not, the government is right to intervene. And I would argue that Google is not really deploying its power very carefully in this case. And, it's right for them to kind of get in trouble for that.
I think Google, in many cases, in many verticals, in many ways, has been completely inept at deploying its power. It couldn't find a social strategy with two hands and a flashlight. Couldn't find a communication strategy, chat strategy, messaging strategy. With two, it can't. It's now struggling with its AI strategy. I mean, it's relatively inept.
There are no laws against ineptitude. That's the good thing.
Well, again, this is a double standard, right? So where it is inept, it's like, oh, that's okay, you're allowed to be inept. But where it's finding some traction, it's like, oh my God, hang on a second, you're not allowed to do that. It's like, give me a break. And it's
dude, that is not a double standard. Of course you're allowed to be inept. What you can't do is exploit your existing advantage in one market to win in another market. Like, that is the fundamental basis of antitrust law.
There are people using their advantages to win in different markets, different segments, different personas, different applications all day long. And without Google, Android would not exist. We're talking about consumers deserve choice on Android. Who made Android? Google. It's like saying, oh, well, you've got a beautiful mansion. Let me give you another example. You got a beautiful mansion. You're a multimillionaire. You made a crap load of money. You got a beautiful mansion. You've bought the property. And then it's like a bunch of people on your street go, who the hell are you? Do you think that you to keep all those rooms? We're going to go and camp out in your rooms. It's like, fuck off. This is my house.
With respect, I don't think you have understood the fundamental premise of antitrust law.
I get the premise. I just don't like it.
No, seriously, because you keep saying it's a house that Standard Oil built. It was the house that Bell built, but the US government broke these things up because the house became too powerful. That's the whole point.
Yeah, I get the point, but I'm saying in an era where, as Bill Gates said, any guy in a garage can be my competitor. Antitrust law is out of date, and right now, Perplexity, which is 50 guys, 20 guys and girls in a garage, are kicking their ass, and they're struggling to survive. And this is the exact wrong time to tell Google, hey, sit down, shut up, you're a monopoly. It's more like, holy crap, your entire business is at risk. Maybe we should let you try to compete a little bit. I don't know. Anyway, just it's about timing. It's about, who do you want making your decisions. And I'm not a free market purist by any means, or a kind of laissez-faire market person. But I just think that this is in tech. When you talk about network effects, you talk about the cost of innovation going down and execution going down. When you talk about platforms, which Amir, you and I have built platforms aplenty, and so have you, Yaniv, with Google Maps. This is how much effort, how much blood, sweat, and tears it takes to design the rails. They're opinionated enough that they create useful rails, but not so amorphous that they're that they don't really contain anything, that you maintain great incentives, that you curate, that you kill bad actors, that you make partnerships. Like, building the Android platform, building any platform is just really, really hard. And then saying to an OEM, well, hey, if you want our apps on the platform, you got to take our apps. Our apps work together. Like, that's perfectly reasonable bet. Perfectly a reasonable deal to make.
And every platform does it. If you go to Tesla, you get apps. If you go to if you go to iPhone, you get apps. On every platform, you get the default apps.
Yeah, it's like saying, why doesn't Tesla include like Google Waze as one of the options? It's like, because they don't.
Guys, I'm frustrated by this conversation, because what you keep ignoring is it's about the monopoly power. This is not anti-competitive behavior unless you're a monopoly, right? So I think these arguments are a waste of airspace, right? Because you're talking about something that's not relevant.
Tesla has a monopoly on Tesla interfaces, Tesla screens.
Okay, very clever. Okay, I think we're done with this.
The audience loved it when mom and dad have an argument, so hopefully that's been the next thing for everyone.